I hope you can hear me. I am so glad to see so many of you here today. There is so much that we can learn from Professor Mel Leffler, who is, of course, a long-standing member of CBI. What? Hold or closer, better? Okay, great. Mel is the Edward Stentinius Professor of History Emeritus at UVA. He is among the most eminent diplomatic historians in the world, and most certainly one of the most esteemed historians of the Cold War. He has written so much and received so many of the highest honors that are given to an historian. Policymakers consult Mel and carefully read what he has written. Today, he will speak about his most recent book, Confronting Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush, and the Invasion of Iraq. In this book, he brings so much to light on the question of how, in the post-9/11 world, the President of the United States made what turned out to be the disastrous decision to go to war with Iraq. He will talk to us about decisions that were taken over 20 years ago by American leaders who were fearful for our country, and how this fear, not without reason, focused on Saddam Hussein. When I read Mel's book, I was so impressed, among other things, with his emphasis on decision-making, both by George Bush and by Saddam Hussein. They both were actors in the tragedy. There didn't have to have been an Iraq war. I very much admired Mel's willingness to come to conclusions that contradicted many of the things that were commonly thought about the initiation of the Iraq war. And as we know too well, Israel has been living in a post-October 7th world. Its leaders have made decisions for a nation that, was threatened by a brutal attack, and their whole security was threatened, and there are similarities. Certainly, too, Israel's basic assumptions about their security was shattered. What are the parallels with the U.S. in 2003? These are very difficult questions that Mel can help us to think about. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks for that very lovely introduction. Most of all, thanks for orchestrating all these sessions for so many years that go on here on Sunday afternoons. So we really owe you a real debt. So on 9/11, as almost all of you know, 19 Al-Qaeda jihadists flew 2 planes into the World Trade Center and 1 into the Pentagon. A 4th plane, as you all know, crashed to the ground in the middle of Pennsylvania. The attack killed about 3,000 people. The attack intentionally struck the most emblematic symbols of American economic and military power, the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. That was intentional. Americans, of course, were stunned, outraged, mournful. Top officials in the Bush administration, as I describe in my book, were shocked, infuriated, humiliated, sorrowful, and vengeful. The Hamas attack on Israel on 10/7 killed about 1,200 people. The Hamas terrorists, about 1,000 of them, killed, raped, and pillaged indiscriminately. As you all know, they seized about 240 hostages. Every day, we read about the Israeli reaction. Was it wise or foolish? Was it prudent or counter-effective? Was it legal or illegal? Was it moral or immoral? Since I published my book about 2 years ago on the invasion of Iraq, I keep wondering about whether the reaction of US officials to 9/11 can help us to understand the Israeli reaction. I keep wondering whether the lessons learned, or whether those that should have been learned from the American experience, offer us tools to understand and to assess the Israeli reaction. So today, I'm going to talk about the Bush administration's reaction to 9/11. I'm going to enumerate the lessons that I think could be learned, probably should have been learned. But keep in mind, these are not easy lessons. They are excruciatingly hard to apply. Policymaking is tough, challenging, agonizing. Finally, today, I'm going to try to summarize and hopefully engage all of you in a conversation about whether the American experience, in fact, is salient to grasping and to assessing Israeli actions after 10/7. Now, almost all scholars, including myself, believe that the American invasion of Iraq turned into a disaster. Some would call it a tragedy. The invasion, the insurgency, and the counterinsurgency that followed led to the deaths of about 200,000 Iraqis. The war, the insurgency, and the counterinsurgency led to the displacement of 9 million Iraqis, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the entire Iraqi population was displaced over the next 10 years. 9,000 American soldiers and private contractors died in Iraq. It's now estimated that for the United States, the total cost of the American engagement in Iraq will come to about $2 trillion, that's with a T, $2 trillion. The invasion of Iraq, moreover, damaged American foreign policy. Almost everyone agrees that it distracted attention from Afghanistan. It allowed Iran to gain predominant power in the Persian Gulf. It diverted attention from Russia's revisionism and from China's rise. The invasion, insurgency, and counterinsurgency intensified anti-Americanism, and it fueled Islamic fundamentalism. Overall, the invasion of Iraq complicated rather than aided Bush's global war on terror. Because the invasion turned into a tragedy, it's naturally garnered a huge amount of criticism. Over time, and it's now, believe it or not, almost 25 years, over time, the criticisms of the Bush administration have become foundational beliefs. Are these beliefs true, or are they myths? Let me state some of these foundational views, many of which I suspect you hold. First foundational belief. Bush was intent on going to war from the first day of his administration, from day one. Second, Saddam Hussein was not a threat. No reason to have been preoccupied with him. By then, 2001, 2002, he was an aging, innocuous tyrant. Third, Bush lied about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction in order to get the United States into the war. You know the famous saying, Bush lied, Americans died. Fourth, Bush was a weak leader, the pawn of neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz, or conservative nationalists like Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. Fifth, Bush had no strategy and no plans for the post-war period in Iraq. And lastly, and most importantly perhaps, Bush went to war for mistaken or greedy or unjust or naive reasons. When people are asked around the globe to respond to the question, why did the United States go to war in Iraq for 2003? The two most common responses globally by far are one, the United States wanted to control Iraqi oil, and two, the United States went to war in order to assist Israel. Other motivations, often claimed, are Bush's naive desire to spread democracy, or to redress the mistakes of his father, or to seek revenge for Saddam Hussein's effort to assassinate his father in 1993. Now, in my book, I try to address all these foundational views. I try to address the question of, why did Bush go to war in Iraq? Why did Bush go to war in Iraq? And why did things go wrong so quickly? Now, let me just tell you a bit about the sources I used to write my book. First, I used as many declassified American documents as I could get hold of. Keep in mind, these are still to this day a very, very limited number, but some policymakers like Donald Rumsfeld and Douglas Feith, when they published their memoirs, also were able to declassify hundreds of documents. Various agencies committed to declassification and to transparency have secured lots of documents through Freedom of Information requests, etc. I used as many declassified documents as I could get hold of, but it's still a tiny percentage of what exists. I used British documents from a parliamentary inquiry that took place between 2010 and about 2017. Basically, the British Parliament created a commission, and the query was, why did Tony Blair take Britain into war on the side of the United States? It was not about American policymaking, but this parliamentary inquiry that went on for about 7 years, this commission interviewed every leading member of the British government, including like 1,700 pages of interviews with Tony Blair himself, probably 1,200 to 1,400 pages with the foreign minister, Jack Straw, every single member of the British government, in the intelligence agencies, in the military establishment. Now, it was about British policy, but frequently the policymakers talked about their conversations with US officials. Blair talked about his meetings with George Bush. David Manning, essentially Blair's national security advisor, talked about his meetings with Condi Rice. And what was most important about this British inquiry was that every time an official referenced a document, so that if Jack Straw said, well, I got this memorandum from the Minister of Defense, the commission had the right to subpoena the actual document. And over about 5 years periods of time, almost all these documents went up on a website, which I used extensively. I also used the captured Iraqi documents that the United States seized when it occupied Baghdad. Not many, but a significant percentage of these documents have been translated. I read the translated documents. You'll be interested to know that Saddam Hussein himself actually taped many of his conversations with his advisors, and American military forces seized these tapes, and sort of the best of Saddam's recordings have been published in a book by Cambridge University Press that's accessible to everybody. I used printed United Nations documents regarding Iraqi compliance with UN resolutions. And finally, I used a very unique set of interviews that I myself conducted for very unique circumstances that I can elaborate on in the question period if you're interested, but for quite unique circumstances. I had the opportunity to interview virtually every important official in the Bush administration, except the president himself, who, prior to my writing the book, turned down my request for an interview. But I interviewed Paul Wolfowitz for 10 to 12 hours on 3 or 4 different occasions. I interviewed Scooter Libby for 6 to 10 hours. I talked to Secretary of State Colin Powell for an hour, 5 hours with his Deputy Secretary of State, Richard Armitage. I talked for about 5 hours with Michael Morell, who was Bush's daily CIA briefer, and so on and so forth. And these interviews greatly informed the book that I wrote. So now I'll briefly state my conclusions, but rather than dwell on these conclusions, I prefer to focus on the lessons learned. But first, a quick statement of the conclusions that relate to many of these foundational views that I enumerated earlier. First conclusion was that Bush did not come into office intent on going to war in Iraq. He did want regime change. He did want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, but it was unequivocally not a priority of his or of his administration. And certainly Bush had no intention when he came into office of sending an army into Iraq. And one small illustration of this, but important one, is that, for example, there were no updated war plans for going to war in Iraq prior to 9/11. Second, Bush was not a pawn of his advisors. The evidence shows that he himself orchestrated almost all of the important decisions regarding Iraq. Bush, I show in my book, was a strong leader. He wasn't necessarily a wise leader, but he was a strong leader, and all of his advisors, virtually every one of them, even some who have become extremely critical, acknowledge that Bush was in control of his administration. Third, I show that Bush did not lie about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. US intelligence agencies believed that Iraq had chemical weapons and biological weapons, or if it did not then possess them, could recreate those programs in very short time. We have many of these intelligence reports now. They are available, and they demonstrate unequivocally that the intelligence agencies believed that Iraq had or could restart chemical and biological warfare programs very quickly. They were wrong. The intelligence agencies were wrong. Bush was wrong. but he was not lying. Fourth, Saddam Hussein was not a benign, aging tyrant. He was a ruthless dictator seeking to evade the sanctions and to increase his military capabilities. And he was increasing his conventional military capabilities in the late 1990s. He also hoped to reconstitute his WMD programs and to revive Iraqi power throughout the Persian Gulf and the Middle East once the sanctions and the inspections were over. Another conclusion. It's wrong to say that Bush had no strategy. He actually did have a strategy. He and Condi Rice always called it coercive diplomacy. The problem with the strategy was it didn't work. Another conclusion. Bush did not go to war for oil, or to assist Israel, or to get even with Saddam Hussein for having tried to assassinate his father. I was particularly interested in investigating each of these motives, especially the most frequently stated one, that he went to war to grab control of Iraqi oil. And there's virtually no evidence of that. And as for the notion that he went to war to spread democracy, that too is erroneous. Bush went to war for security reasons, but he did hope, and he stated frequently, that if he went to war, he hoped to bring about democracy. But that was not the reason that motivated him to go to war. So I show in my book that Bush went to war because he regarded Saddam Hussein as a looming threat. Not an imminent threat, but a looming threat. That was the word that was often used. Bush felt a keen sense of responsibility to prevent another attack. He felt that he needed to regain, a word that you've heard frequently, credibility. He needed to regain credibility with America's enemies abroad, as well as with Americans at home. But that sense of responsibility I show in my book was coupled with and inspired by heavy doses of humiliation, revenge, hubris, a sense of victimhood, and political expediency. All those things were intertwined. And my last conclusion in the book is that the occupation of Iraq turned into a tragedy, a disaster, not because of an absence of planning. There was a lot of planning, but because of administrative dysfunction, rampant administrative dysfunction that I discuss at length in the last chapter of my book. So now, what are the lessons to be learned? Frankly, the lessons are easy to state, but they are extremely hard to apply. They're easy to state. Many of them will seem commonplace, but when you think about applying them, it's really, really challenging. So when we look back, one critical lesson that almost everyone would agree upon was that it's important to modulate your fears and control your emotions, even when those fears are real and totally understandable. American policymakers believed after 9/11 that another attack was imminent. The intelligence agencies, in fact, almost immediately after 9/11, about 2 weeks after 9/11, developed what they called a threat matrix. Every day, intelligence analysts met at the CIA at 5 o'clock in the afternoon to enumerate in what they called a matrix. It's really a list. They like to call it a matrix of all the threats that they had received during the preceding 24 hours. And on a typical day, Michael Morrell, Bush's daily briefer, would come in to the Oval Office with the threat matrix. And they would go, Bush had already read it. And Bush would ask him, okay, how serious is number 4? How much do I have to worry about number 17? What do you think of number 23? That was the threat matrix. Every day, almost all intelligence analysts will now tell you this was a terrible idea. But this is what was going on every day. So Bush had reason to believe another threat was imminent. And it was compounded by the fact that some of you may recall that just 2 weeks after 9/11, anthrax spores circulated in American mail. About a dozen people died from exposure to these anthrax spores. This stimulated an enormous fear about the possibility of a chemical or a biological attack. And the fear was accentuated by the fact that at that very time, October of 2001, when the anthrax spores were circulating, American special forces inside Afghanistan went into the al-Qaeda camps. The al-Qaeda had dispersed. And inside the camps, the special forces found unmistakable, unequivocal evidence that al-Qaeda was seeking to develop or to acquire chemical and biological weapons. And so policymakers immediately asked the most natural question: where is al-Qaeda going to get chemical or biological weapons? And their attention instantly gravitated to Iraq, because Iraq was, quote, known to have had chemical and biological weapons. That's why attention gravitated to Iraq, especially when Saddam Hussein, I think literally the only ruler or head of state in the entire world, applauded what had happened on 9/11. So while the fears of George Bush and his advisors were real, and in my view, their sense of responsibility actually admirable, policymakers nevertheless allowed their fears, their hubris, their sense of victimhood, and their humiliation over what had happened on 9/11 on their watch to overwhelm their prudence. Simply stated, their fears were exaggerated. Iraq didn't have chemical and biological weapons. The regime had destroyed them or relinquished them or moved them. American sovereignty, the American, quote, way of life that policymakers like to talk about, that was the phrase they used, the American way of life actually was not endangered. Despite the loss of life and despite the enormous destruction that was actually caused on 9/11, there was no existential threat to the United States, although many Americans thought there was. This leads to a second lesson. One always needs to re-examine assumptions. I'm sure you all agree with that, but how often do you really re-examine your most fundamental assumptions? How often do I re-examine my fundamental assumptions? Don't ask Phyllis, but now the most fundamental assumption in 2001 was that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. There was good reason for that assumption. As a historian, I'm particularly attracted to the reasons that were cited all the time by policymaker after policymaker. What was so obvious? Iraq had had weapons of mass destruction. Iraq had used weapons of mass destruction. Iraq had lied about the weapons of mass destruction. Why not think that Iraq still had them, even though prevailing evidence, as I show in my book, was flimsy and ambiguous? There was good reason to question the conclusions of American intelligence agencies, very good reasons. But since those conclusions actually comported with policymakers' fundamental assumptions, those conclusions were never re-examined. You need to re-examine fundamental conclusions. Intelligence agencies now have been working very hard to institutionalize that as a way of life within their agencies, but it's very hard to re-examine fundamental assumptions. A third lesson was the importance of defining priorities. Bush never could make up his mind about whether his number one priority was making sure that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, or whether his number one priority was to get rid of Saddam Hussein, or whether he most wanted to nurture a democratic revolution inside Iraq. These things were always in tension with one another, and he never resolved the tension between those priorities, never. So clearly, a generalization that you will all agree with. You need to resolve priorities. How good are you guys at resolving your priorities? I'm not very good at it. They're always in conflict with one another. This is difficult, but it's a lesson. Another lesson that clearly emerges from the experience after 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq. You need to grasp the limits of your power. You need to grasp the limits of your power. You need to have, another way of saying this is that you need to have realistic goals. It was easy, very easy, to defeat Saddam Hussein's armies and to dislodge him from power. We had the capability of doing that, but it was incredibly more difficult to reshape a society, orchestrate a transition of political power, and nurture democracy. Those things are incredibly hard to do. You need to think about that when you exercise power. And that means, another lesson, you need to link means and ends, something the United States did not do. The United States had sufficient troops to crush Saddam Hussein's armies. Actually, the military part of the war was immensely successful. The United States had the troops to overthrow Saddam Hussein. But the United States never had sufficient troops to preserve security after Saddam Hussein was overthrown. The United States never allocated sufficient resources to build democratic institutions. Means and ends were not linked. And the reason means and ends were not linked, in part, was because there was such an amazing amount of discord amongst the top policymakers themselves about the goals they were trying to achieve inside Iraq. President Bush and his Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, clearly the most important policymaker in the decision-making process, other than the president himself, Bush and Rumsfeld had fundamentally different preoccupations. Bush believed, as I suggested earlier, that if the United States went into Iraq, it was essential then to demonstrate to the world its benign aspirations by creating and nurturing democracy. Let me state bluntly, Donald Rumsfeld didn't care a damn about nurturing democracy inside Iraq. The same disagreement existed between General Franks, who was the head of American military forces inside of Iraq, the head of Central Command until he left shortly after the war, and Paul Bremer, who George Bush appointed to head the so-called Coalition Provisional Authority that was going to temporarily run Iraq. They totally disagreed on how important it was to nurture democracy. The State Department and the Defense Department, as I show in my book, bitterly feuded over who would rule Iraq once Saddam Hussein was overthrown, over who would rule, who would come to power. The State Department had its own ideas, and the Defense Department officials had their ideas, and President Bush never really resolved the disputes. Understanding your goal is pretty fundamental, don't you think? That's a good lesson to learn when you're making important decisions. What am I really trying, what are we all trying to accomplish? And another lesson that's critical was to analyze the costs and consequences before committing to a strategy. The strategy, as I described, I'm not going to talk about it here, was so-called coercive diplomacy. But there was no realistic assessment of the costs of this strategy, of the prospective costs of this strategy. In fact, there were critical Defense Department officials like Paul Wolfowitz himself who adamantly opposed any effort to assess what might be the costs. Finally, lastly, a key lesson of what went on in American decision-making circles before the invasion of Iraq was the need, which I know you'll all agree with, good staff work, good staff work. This did not happen. Anyone reading the existing documents will be pretty amazed by how poor the staff work was, by how poor the memos were. So just one quick illustration. The most important memo written for Secretary of State Powell was by Bill Burns, who was then the head of the Office of Near Eastern Affairs, who's just left the Biden administration as the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, a person known as a really, really good diplomat and a smart individual. And he had his office work up in August 2002, a memo for Secretary of State Powell that Powell actually had in his suit pocket when he had an incredibly important conversation, private conversation, just with him, just between him, Condi Rice, and President Bush in the early days of August 2002. This was the memo that informed Powell, or did not inform Powell, because the memo was available. And it's stunning. It first says, you know, an invasion of Iraq could turn out to be okay. We're not really certain about it, but let me tell you, let us tell you all the things that could go wrong. And first, here are all the things that could go wrong leading up to an invasion of Iraq. And then there are about literally 18 things that could go wrong, some of which, when you read in retrospect, seem, yeah, pretty salient, and others are absolutely ridiculous. But there are 18, 20 things that could go wrong. Then it says, here are all the things that could go wrong during the invasion. And there are about 20 things listed that could go wrong during the invasion. Then part 3 of the memo is, here are all the things that could go wrong after the invasion. Part 3 is divided into 2 parts. And each part has about 25 things that could go wrong after the invasion. Nobody reading this memo would have any sense whatsoever of what is most likely to go wrong, what you should be most preoccupied with. It didn't say, number 1 is the most important thing that might go wrong. It just listed things. Good staff work by middle-level officials, which Bill Burns was at that point in time, and his own staff, are critical to making good decisions. Now, how do these lessons apply to Israel's reactions to the attack on 10/7? Keep in mind, once again, that extrapolating lessons does not mean that it's easy to apply the lessons, as I've been emphasizing. So first of all, I would suggest that Israeli fears after 10/7, like American fears after 9/11, are totally understandable. Hezbollah might do in the north what Hamas did in the south, did in Gaza. But once again, while shock, sorrow, anger, and humiliation are totally understandable, the essential thing to grapple with is it correct? Is it correct to think that 10/7 constituted an existential threat to the survival of Israel, giving the overwhelming military superiority and Israel's nuclear arsenal? Fear must be measured, even when it's justifiable. Emotions must be tempered, even when we totally understand why they are pulsating through decision-making circles. A second lesson that might apply has to do with the importance of rethinking basic assumptions. Just as American officials mistakenly assumed that Iraq still had weapons of mass destruction, Israeli intelligence agencies and policymakers assumed that Hamas was deterred, that Hamas would not attack. there was reason, ample reason, to question that assumption. But reassessing basic assumptions is agonizingly difficult and also time-consuming. Yet, it's indispensable to do so. Third, defining priorities. Just as Bush had difficulty resolving conflicting priorities and aspirations, Israeli officials have had a painfully hard time on agreeing on priorities. Should the number one priority be liberating hostages? Should it be killing all Hamas terrorists? Should it be destroying Hamas's military capabilities? Should it be ending Hamas's political control of Gaza? Should it be grappling with Hezbollah in the north? Should it be dealing with Iran? Israeli officials have had an incredibly hard time grappling with these conflicting priorities, just as American officials had a hard time after 9/11. Should the United States go into Afghanistan? Should it go into Iraq? Should it focus on Iran? Should it engage in a global war on terror? These were all conflicting priorities. And they're understandable that it's really hard to resolve them. But still, making choices is critical. Another lesson. Like the United States in Iraq, I would suggest that Israel has had a difficult time grasping the limits of its own power and also linking means and ends. As the United States found out in Iraq, it's easy to demolish a regime and to kill terrorists. It's much, much harder to thwart or defeat the ideological influence of a terrorist organization, or to create alternative political institutions in an occupied country. Those things are very hard to do, and one has to grapple either with the limits of your power or really, really work at linking means and ends. And in this sense, Israel, like the United States, has had trouble linking means and ends. For example, if you wished to eliminate Hamas's political control, you need to have alternative options to rule Gaza, just like the United States needed to have alternative options to rule Iraq, which they could not agree on for a long time. If you wish to eradicate Hamas's military control, you need to have enough soldiers to occupy strongholds and to hold them. The overriding lesson in Iraq in dealing with insurgents, and it was a lesson very hard learned, the overriding lesson in Iraq dealing with insurgents was that you would only succeed, the United States would only succeed if its forces attacked a terrorist stronghold and stayed there and rebuilt and did not withdraw. For years, the United States attacked terrorist strongholds and then withdrew. The overriding lesson that General Petraeus insisted upon when he became a key influence, the overriding lesson was that you needed to seize, hold, and rebuild. That was sort of the framework of the so-called surge, which did not take place until 2007. Seize, hold, rebuild. The problem with seizing, holding, and rebuilding, the challenge is that it's incredibly costly in manpower and financial resources. But you need to link means and ends. Israel has not really done that in Gaza. And sometimes it means narrowing your ends, or it means expanding your means. Now, to link means and ends effectively, you need to assess costs and probable consequences before you take action or embrace a strategy. Israel failed to grasp the costs and consequences of its Gaza mission. Israeli officials, I think, underestimated the tunnel structure in Gaza. Israeli officials underestimated the military capabilities of Hamas. They underestimated the tenacity of the enemy, and they underestimated the reputational fallout of their military mission. Grappling with costs and consequences is important in order to really bring about a linkage between means and ends. And once again, to link means and ends, you need to have excellent staff work. And in recent weeks and months, there's been much criticism of the military staff work in Israel, as well as the accuracy of Israeli intelligence. In my opinion, we still have inadequate knowledge to really judge whether these criticisms are appropriate or inappropriate. But it may turn out that the staff work and the military advice actually was good. That may turn out, despite the criticisms that we're seeing. And it may be that Netanyahu simply did not pay heed to this advice. We really don't know the details yet. But it does seem clear that Israel did not have effective plans to conduct full-scale military operations in Gaza, and much has been improvised. So to sum up, I think 9/11 offers a good framework to assess the aftermath of 10/7. It should help us to understand, and I would emphasize, it should help us to empathize with the Israeli reaction, the shock, the sorrow, the fear, the humiliation, the lust for revenge, and the sense of responsibility to deter additional attacks. All these, I think, we should empathize with and understand and think that they are appropriate. But 9/11 should also offer us a lens to assess and critique the Israeli response. It offers a framework to identify the strengths and the weaknesses of Israel's response. Most of all, in conclusion, my study of decision-making after 9/11 suggests that all of us need to grasp how agonizing and how difficult are the choices faced by policymakers. But much as we need to empathize, my book's been criticized for too much empathy, but much as we need to empathize, we also need to criticize. The Bush administration officials hate the criticism in my book. But much as we need to empathize, we also need to criticize. Because the choices of our leaders, whether they be in Israel or in the United States, have huge, dramatic consequences for all of us. Thank you. Well, there's time for questions, comments, responses. Yeah, certainly.
Can you give an update on what's happening in Iraq today?
A very vulnerable democratic government is trying to govern a country that is fused with political instability, conflicting factions, militias that are often not under the control of the government itself. So it is, Bush administration officials would like to say that it is the only democracy, even today, in the Middle East, but it is a very fragile, vulnerable democracy, but probably better than most of the governments in the region.
Thank you very much. With 2020 hindsight now, it's easy to see that there were places where it would have helped if we'd had better intelligence. How can we improve that?
It's very hard to have good intelligence, and it depends what the issue is. You know, one of the problems in Iraq, as well as one of the problems in Gaza, in recent years in Gaza and in the years right before the invasion of Iraq, was that American intelligence agencies lost most of its human intelligence sources inside Iraq. Saddam Hussein wiped them out because of previous errors that intelligence agencies had made. But basically, our human intelligence was really eradicated. And the same seems to be true from what I've read about what has happened in Gaza in the last couple of years. Israeli sources inside Gaza have been decimated by a systematic effort of Hamas to kill agents, saboteurs, people who are expected of giving intelligence. Now, of course, we have, you know, incredibly sophisticated technological means, and so does Israel. But what we know is that often the technology does not keep up with the challenges. So Israel has used incredibly sophisticated technology to try to identify the tunnel structure inside Gaza prior to 10/7, but they totally underestimated the magnitude of the tunnels. So there's a key question about what I'm talking about now is collecting intelligence. Then there's the issue of analyzing the intelligence, you know, that is collected. And what's true in Israel after, you know, we now know, was that there were reports of a likely attack. There were reports of that. And in the prior 24 hours, there were even greater reports of a likely attack. But there was also conflicting information. This is the same thing as before the attack on 9/11. There were many warnings of some incredible forthcoming attack prior to 9/11. The intelligence agencies and George Tenet, the head of the CIA, went to the White House and he said, our signals are blinking red. There is going to be another attack. There's going to be an attack, a huge attack. And President Bush said to him, where will it be? I don't know. When will it take place? I don't know. Is it going to be in the United States? Probably not. We don't think so, and so on and so forth. The intelligence analysts inside the American intelligence agencies were grappling with conflicting information, just as the Israeli intelligence analysts were doing right before 10/7, even in the 24 hours prior to the attack. And it's a question, of course, it's easy for us. Now we read in the newspaper, oh, these women military intelligence analysts found, communicated evidence that an attack was imminent. But then there's also conflicting evidence that's always coming in and saying, no, that's not really true. We don't really believe that. And what intelligence agencies now are trying to do is to create what they call these red cells. And that is an emphasis on focusing direct assessments on what we don't expect, what we don't think is likely, and to sort of focus on, should we think that's likely? What's all the evidence to think? We know that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, but what's all the evidence that says it doesn't have Iraq? And that's the same thing. We know we have evidence that Hamas is not likely to attack, but what is the evidence that an attack really could take place? And to try to institutionalize efforts to sort of force agency leaders to re-examine and rethink assumptions. That's analysis. There's collection, there's analysis, and then there's also dissemination and coordination within policymaking. And that is that often the coordination between divergent intelligence agencies is not very good. And it's important to try to coordinate them. So those are all the types of things that need to be worked on.
Mel, thank you very much for a superb presentation. One difference I would like to get your opinion on this is that when we invaded Iraq, we strengthened Iran worldwide. However, when Israel retaliated against Gaza and then started the cascade of Hezbollah being defeated and then Iran being defeated in Syria, it now globally appears to make Iran weaker. Is that an analogy, comparison that's valid?
I think that's a critically important issue, and when we eventually evaluate the pluses and minuses of the war in Gaza, we will need to consider exactly that. I'm inclined to think at this moment that Israel's overall strategic position has probably been enhanced today. But the question is, the real question is, do we need to wage that type of war inside Gaza in order to enhance, to gather those advantages elsewhere? That, I think, is the critical question that bears on the extraordinarily important today. So overall today, I think some people would argue with it, but I think Israel's strategic position is better today, overall strategic position. But could have been achieved at much less cost, much less cost.
Yes, thank you. Two questions. First about Iraq. Before the war started, was there any consideration that, and this is a piggyback to the last question, that Saddam was doing us a favor by having war with Iran for over 10 years, that the ultimate irony of all this is that Iran now, because of the war, is in a better position. Now, in terms of Israel, with the lessons that you were talking about, right from the beginning, what options did Israel have? Should they have done nothing and just wait for the next attack? Should they not have gone into Ramallah? Everybody talks about what were the different options that Israel had?
Well, there are a huge calibration of options between doing nothing and carrying out a full-scale, comprehensive military operation aimed, as Netanyahu said, at killing all the terrorists or eradicating Hamas. So, you know.
Could you elaborate on what could they have done?
What could Israel have done?
After they invaded.
Clearly, Israel could have taken a number of limited military options in terms of focusing on particular Hamas headquarters, going after specific Hamas leaders, which they subsequently did, for example, with Hezbollah. These things would have taken time and required patience. I think that some immediate reaction in terms of inflicting harm on key operations centers that were known to exist would have made sense and might have been able to quell the understandable public demand for a reaction, and then perhaps Israel could have taken the time to systematically go after leaders, as they've done with Hezbollah, for example. That's what I think. And by the way, the United States wound up doing that, right? In terms of after 9/11. The United States had a choice. Should we go after al-Qaeda leaders? And if you might remember, there was a list of leaders. There were even these sort of cards of, the 77 key leaders to go after. And a lot of people would say, yes, the United States needed to do something. And toppling the Taliban government with limited forces inside Afghanistan and disrupting the al-Qaeda camps made a lot of sense. Going to invade Iraq didn't make enough sense, even though there was reason to worry about what Iraq might do. But instead of doing that, you could have simply focused on the so-called global war on terror, meaning pinpointing specific terrorists in different places and going after them. Now, the problem with that, just to say, the problem with that in a democratic country is that political leaders think that those types of systematic actions that take a lot of time will not palliate domestic constituencies. And clearly that was one of the key factors also shaping Israel's response, the government's response. There's an overwhelming demand, emotional demand, for some retaliatory action. So I'm simply suggesting it could have been much more calibrated and much more pinpointed than what has taken place.
Some other questions here? Sherry, then Russ.
And I thank you for all of this, but I find myself being kind of depressed. I guess to follow up a little bit on the last question and your response, you've talked a lot about the sort of human factor in some of these decisions and strategies and right turns and wrong turns that have been taken. And it seems like humiliation is a very strong driver of what ends up happening. If a leader or a country feels humiliated, that drives what then is done, and it seems to override what could perhaps be a more thoughtful, better strategy in the long run. So that said, I guess what I'm wondering about, how that can be dealt with, and also in terms of your own book and the reactions and responses to, I think, your very important messages. Maybe you could say a little more about that, how your book has been received.
So, Sherry, in my opinion, the issue of humiliation is absolutely critical. I think that officials in the Bush administration, the president himself, and everyone around him felt humiliated after 9/11. Why did they feel humiliated? They felt humiliated because they knew they had been warned of an impending major attack. They also knew, and in my opinion, their judgment, at least in retrospect, in my opinion, is correct, that there was nothing that they really could have done to stop the 9/11 attack. Nonetheless, what they knew, and what they knew Americans knew, was that they had been warned, and they nevertheless had not taken sufficient actions to deal with the threat. Not to say, once again, that I think they could have stopped it, but they didn't do things that they might have done. And the 9/11 Commission report at length enumerates what specific steps that might have been done that were not taken. So what's on the minds of the policymakers, I mean, this was so clear in my interviews, and it's also clear in the memoirs, is this sense of embarrassment that they are charged with protecting the American people, and they failed. I mean, they say that to one another. We failed. Now, there's partly humiliation in that, but I stress in my book, and I really feel this, that it's not just humiliation. It's also a sense of appropriate responsibility. They were warned. They should have taken action. They know they should have taken action, and they didn't do quite what they should have done, even if it still wouldn't have thwarted an attack. I think we don't know as much yet about Israeli decision makers. We don't see the memoirs yet. We don't have the internal investigatory report yet. So it's hard to say, but it's easy to think that top leaders who knew that they had received some warnings, especially in the preceding 24 hours, and did not take them seriously, felt both a sense of embarrassment and humiliation, and also a sense of responsibility. I mean, they are charged with protecting the lives of Israelis, and they failed, and they take it seriously. Policymakers take these things seriously. That's their overriding, if you talk to them, what's my overriding obligation as the head of the Defense Department? It is to protect the lives of the American people. That sounds like a cliche, but actually people believe that, and Israeli officials believe that. So you say in terms of the reception of my book, one of the criticisms of my book is that I take that too seriously, and that my emphasis on the sense of responsibility, the feelings of humiliation are overdrawn in my book. I don't think that's the case, but if you ask me honestly about what's one of the key reactions, I mean, my book has gotten a lot of good praise, but if you're asking about some of the criticism, that is one of the criticism, because there's this desire that I think many of us have, that I know I have in many cases, simply to criticize officials and to assign to them sort of sordid motives. So people want to assign sordid motives to the Bush administration. Oh, they wanted to gain control of Iraqi oil. What is amazing to me is I looked so hard to find evidence of that, and there's virtually zero evidence. And I think the same applies often to thinking about how the Israelis are reacting. I mean, we see the horror that's gone on in Gaza, the devastation to civilian institutions and infrastructure, and we assign, many people assign sordid motives to this. And often now, in the last 4 months, numerous articles about, Israeli soldiers seeking revenge and engaging in brutal actions, and we see a lot of, or read a lot about brutality and vengeance, and I think once again those things are happening, but you need to weigh that against what this question here implied a few minutes ago. You need to do something. Israeli officials had to do something. That was their sense of responsibility, and that's also a result of their humiliation. But I also should add, and here is a sordid motive that gets conflated with what I'm saying, and that is, in each of these cases, political expediency is extremely salient. Bush and his top officials, you can see it. We're worried. Yes, we feel humiliated. We're worried that the American people will see that we failed them and they're going to vote us out of office. We are the party. We are the party of national security, and we failed. I would say one of the great ironies of George W. Bush's administration is that the issue over which they were most politically vulnerable, the attack on 9/11, they translated that into their overriding political attribute for 2 or 3 years, saying that we will keep you safe. And so also, I mean, as we read all the time, it's even clearer in the Israeli case, the issues of political expediency that are conflated or intertwined is a better word, that are intertwined with the sense of responsibility and humiliation. These things are not either or. I think to capture the complexity and texture of human behavior and official decision making is that you need to weave all of these things together. It's hard to do. Human beings are complex, and they're responding to divergent impulses within them and also divergent pressures external to them.
One more question, and maybe we can talk to you afterwards.
Absolutely.
Hi, Mel. Thanks for a wonderful analysis and conclusions. A thought and then a question. My thought is that I've always been a fan of Colin Powell's leadership, and you made my admiration rises because you talked about, so importantly, challenging assumptions. To my knowledge, he's the only one publicly among all of Bush's top people who challenged the assumption of WMD. Bush said, go to the UN and defend our position, and Powell, as I recall, demanded a hell of a lot of documentation from the intel community that there really was WMD.
Well, I'll deflate your admiration.
Okay.
For General Powell, because in writing my book, he is one of the people for whom my admiration steadily declined, and that was because I found little evidence that he ever made those arguments in a persuasive way in the critical decision-making forums that existed. So one of the things that people said to me again and again, both people in the State Department and people in the other agencies, his antagonists would say, General Powell never talked up at the meetings of principals, the top national security advisors. He never talked up at the National Security Council meeting. He always wanted to sort of reserve his comments to talk specifically to the president. But because of his own personality, which I think was a flaw, Russ, he had this sense of himself, I'm not going to go to President Bush unless he asks me to come. And Powell very infrequently met alone with President Bush. And so Powell may, almost everyone says, and there's good reason to think that he had reservations, but did he raise them vocally? I don't think so. When I interviewed him, I specifically said to him, General Powell, on this day, August 5th, when you had that critical meeting with President Bush, with Condi Rice, and you had that memo in your pocket, should President Bush have thought, this is exactly what I said to him, should President Bush have thought at the end of the meeting that you were opposed to the invasion of Iraq or to the prospect of an invasion of Iraq? And he said to me, no, he should not have thought that. I was just trying to make him aware of many things that might go wrong, but I wasn't arguing against it. Now, you might say that in talking about the things that could go wrong, he was indirectly doing that. But he himself was unwilling to say, not to me and to others, that inside policy-making circles, he was a strong resistor to what was going on.
And finally, a quick question, and if it's not quick, I can talk to you some other time. To me, it's notable that despite Netanyahu's unwillingness to listen to any objections or any criticism and firing people who do so, and some of the senior Israeli officials are now resigning, saying, it's on me. I don't think anybody in the Bush administration resigned out of humiliation or belief that they failed. Does that say anything about their system in Israel versus ours? It's notable that nobody said, I'm out of here in the Bush administration, despite the disaster.
Yeah, well, keep in mind, you might say, Russ, I don't really know exactly how to respond to your question in terms of, does it say something about the different political institutions? But part of it is a time sequence here. I mean, what went wrong in Iraq often wasn't apparent to a lot of people for 18 months, 24 months, 36 months. In my book, I show that people should have been seeing it right away, that within months of the occupation, you could see that things were really going downhill. But for the most part, that was not clear. It was much more gradual that I think, sort of erased the idea that people had to resign over exactly, what they were doing inside Iraq. Nobody resigned after 9/11 either, actually, and maybe that's the analogy that you're talking about. Now, the Israeli chief of staff, I think it was, resigned, and right, and saying I'm going to take personal responsibility. But as far as I know, and I may well be wrong, he's the only one so far who has explicitly resigned. I mean, General Halebi, General Gallant, left, but not because he really admitted fault, but because of discord. No.
Can you have time for another question, or should we?
I'm happy to answer another question.
You are?
People
okay.
Want to stay.
Oh, people stay. Well, I know Fred
But
was
if
first.
Some of you want to go. I will
up,
not
Fred?
be offended if you don't.
Can you come up here for a minute? What?
So now, thank you for my question then has to do with process.
Wait, I'm sorry.
How did you gain access? I yield my time to Dr. So anyway, thank you for really fascinating analysis. My question is this: so, relations between countries are between two key countries, like the U.S. and Iraq, or Israel and Hamas and Gaza. And we should always critique what the U.S. and Israel do. But sometimes it feels like we have to weird question. It's in my book.
It is.
And then really clear. And then just a, yeah. And then, with Israel and Hamas, where's the conversation about what Hamas did in their part? So that's, my question is, we should, I agree with you, analyze, what the U.S. does and what Israel does. It seems like it's hard to find the conversation about analyzing the smart decisions and bad decisions that the other side makes.
Well, I think that's a really good point. And what's somewhat unique about my book is actually that I really assign real responsibility to Saddam Hussein for what happened, that he bears agency for what went on. I mean, after all, after 9/11, he had 11 months to invite back the inspectors. He didn't do that. All sorts of things that he could have done. Plus the fact that when you review what his actions were inside Iraq, he is a heinous, brutal, horrible, ruthless dictator, one of the worst of the 20th century. So there's really good reason to look at what Iraq does. Just like I think there's absolutely good reason. No one can write about what happens after 10/7 without taking cognizance of what happened on 10/7. You can't imagine Israeli reactions unless you grapple with that reality. So yeah, I'm agreeing with you. Yeah.
You had mentioned the importance of staff work. So how does one gain access to all these people you spoke with? I'm taking this way back before you actually did. This process of gaining access to these government officials, controversial topic, how do you pull that off if that's not a professional secret?
It's not top secret. It really happened fortuitously in the sense that one day at a meeting here at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, there was an official speaking there. This was 2009. Obama was now in office. The Bush administration had left. And there was an official there that came to speak to the Miller Center named Eric Edelman. And I just engaged him in conversation, and we went to lunch. I had never met him before. And turned out that he had a history PhD. I'm a history professor. He was a history PhD from Yale in the 1970s. His career was in the Foreign Service, and then he was a top advisor, first to Strobe Talbot, then to Dick Cheney, then Undersecretary of Defense. He knew a lot of history, a lot of history. We were talking at lunch. And he had read my books, and he really knew my other books that I had written. And he said to me at lunch, you should really write a book about the Bush administration and 9/11 and Iraq. And I said to him, well, Eric, all my work is archivally based. I'm an archives person, and there are no archives that are going to be available to me to write about the Bush administration. He said, I know that, but documents will become available. You're not known to be a very fast writer, so, and documents will become available. But then he said, if you take on this project, and this is the answer to the question, if you take on this project, I will introduce you to my friends in the Bush administration who, were very involved. I left lunch thinking, oh yeah, I've heard this type of thing before. And about 2 weeks later, he wrote me a message and he said, have you made up your mind? And literally, and I wrote back and I said, have you set up any interviews for me? And he said, not yet, but I'll do so. And then about literally 3 days later, I get a message from him and say, here's Paul Wolfowitz's email address, here is Steve Hadley's address, Here's Scooter Libby's email address. I've spoken to all of them. They know about you. If you write them, I think you'll get interviews. And that's how it began. Yeah. And then when you start interviewing one of these people, they tell their friends, usually, if you're somewhat discreet. I wasn't always discreet. But if you do it right, they'll then tell another friend, yeah, respond to Mel Leffler. You know, if he asks for an interview, he's a good guy. He's interested in really finding out the facts. You know, he's not ideologically or politically biased, although Steve Hadley thought I was, but I mean, but that's how it went. And then you know, other friends introduced me to other key policymakers, and I wound up speaking to far more of them than I ever imagined. But it was over a 10-year period of time that I was interviewing these people. And but you know, I never interviewed President Bush during this process, although I really wanted to do so. But I did have like a 3.5-hour conversation with Dick Cheney at his home in Jackson, Wyoming, over, you know, at his dinner table, just the two of us chatting for 3.5 hours, and it was, you know, pretty interesting. So, but that's how it happened. All stemmed from Eric Edelman.